Chapter 7 of the Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness. Recording by Nathan Heck. The Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness, by Horace Kephart. Chapter 7 The Camp. And they shall dwell safely in the wilderness and sleep in the woods. Ezekiel. Good camping grounds are seldom far to seek in a hilly country that is well wooded. There are exceptions, as in the Ozarks, where the rock is a porous limestone, the drainage mostly underground, and there are no brooks, nor are springs as common as one would expect, though when you do strike one, it is a big one. Here a traveler must depend for water chiefly on the creeks and rivers, which may be miles apart. In the level region, whether it be open plain or timbered bottom land, good water and a high and dry site may be hard to find. In any case, when men are journeying through a wild country that is strange to them, they should begin at least 2 hours before sunset to keep a bright lookout for a good place on which to spend the night, and when such is found, they had better accept it at once than run the risk of murdering a night, farther on, wherever the powers of darkness may force them to stop. Campsites. The essentials of a good campsite are these. 1. Pure water. 2. Wood that burns well. In cold weather, there should be either an abundance of sound downwood, or some standing hardwood trees that are not too big for easy felling. 3. An open spot, level enough for the tent and campfire, but elevated above its surroundings so as to have good natural drainage. It must be well above any chance of overflow from the sudden rise of a neighboring stream. Observe the previous flood marks. 4. Grass or browse for the horses, if there are any, and bedding for the men. 5. Straight poles for the tent, or trees convenient for attaching the ridge rope. 6. Security against the spread of fire. 7. Exposure to direct sunlight during a part of the day, especially during the early morning hours. 8. In summer, exposure to whatever breezes may blow. In cold weather, protection against the prevailing wind. It is well to avoid an old camping ground. Its previous occupants will have stripped it of good kindling and downwood, and they and their dogs may have left behind them a legacy of rubbish and fleas. Precautions as to elevation and drainage are especially needful in those parts of the country that are subject to cloudbursts. I have seen a ravine that had been stone dry for months fill 15 feet deep in a few minutes, with a torrent that swept trees and boulders along with it. And it is quite common in many parts of the West for wide bottoms to be flooded in a night. When I was a boy in Iowa, a mover camped for the night on an island in the Coon River, near our place. He had a bag of gold coin, but was out of rations. A sudden flood left him marooned the next morning on a knoll scarce big enough for his team and wagon. He subsisted for a week, like his horses, on the inner bark of cottonwood, and when a rescue party found him, he was kicking his bag of gold over the few yards of dry ground that were left of his domain. Bottom lands and deep woods where the sun rarely penetrates should be avoided, when practicable, for they are damp lairs at best, and in warm weather they are infested with mosquitoes. A ravine or narrow valley between steep hills is a trap for fog, and the cold, heavy air from the head of the hollow pours down it at night, while an undertow of warmer air drawing upward now and then makes the smoke from one's campfire shift most annoyingly. New clearings in the forest are unhealthy, for the sun gets in on plants that are intolerant of strong light. They rot, and poisonous gases arise from the decay, as well as from the recently disturbed soil. If one is obliged to camp in a malarial region, he should not leave the campfire until the sun is up and the fog is dispelled. Sandy beaches and low gravelly points are likely to swarm in summer with midges. Granting that one has much choice in the matter, he should select, in summer, an open knoll, a low ridge, or better still, a bold rocky point jutting out into a river or lake. A low promontory catches the cool breezes which disperse fog and insects, and it is soon dried whenever the sun shines. If one can be found that has a clump of trees on it, pitch the tent in such position that it will get the direct rays of the morning and evening sun, but will be shaded during the heat of the day. This is the ideal site for a summer camp. In cold weather, seek an open park-like spot in the forest where surrounding trees will break the wind, or a bench, natural terrace backed by a cliff, on the leeward side of a hill. In the latter case, build your fire against the cliff and shield the tent with a windbreak. The rock will reflect heat upon the tent and will serve as a smoke conductor as well. On a hillside that is mostly bare, if there be a thicket or a cluster of evergreen trees, get on the downhill side of it. The stream of cold air from above will jump this obstacle and will leave an eddy of comparatively warm, still air immediately below it. The tent should not be set under a tree where it would catch the drip of dew and rain, or of snow-laden boughs, nor near a dead tree, nor amid trees that are shallow-rooted, such as basswood and hemlock, for these are liable to be overthrown by a storm. Avoid, if practicable, the neighborhood of large trees that have brittle limbs, the aspens, poplars, willows, cottonwood, butternut, catalpa, yellow locust, silver maple. Trees that are poor in fat, the oaks, poplars, willows, maples, elms, and ashes, are much more likely to be struck by lightning than those rich in fat, beech, birch, chestnut, basswood. Having selected a site for the camp, clear it of brush, stubs, dead leaves, and rotten wood. Decayed down wood and loose flat stones are likely in a southern country to harbor tarantulas and scorpions, which abound as far north as Missouri. If dry leaves and grass are so thick on the ground as to be dangerous, be careful in burning them off to light them at only one spot at a time, and stand by it with a green bough to whip the fire into subjection if it burns too fast. Making camp. The celerity with which a camp is made depends upon the training and willingness of the men, and the system by which their duties are parceled. Let us suppose that there are 4 in the party, besides the teamster or packer. Then let number 1, who is cook, get out the provisions and utensils, rig up the fireplace, build a fire, and prepare the food for cooking, while number 2 is rustling wood and water. Meantime, numbers 3 and 4 clear the ground and smooth it off, cut tent pegs and poles, unpack the tent, and summon all hands for a minute to assist in raising the tent and pegging it square. Then the cook goes on with his proper duties, the axeman cuts and beds a chopping block and gets in night wood, and the canvasmen turn bed makers. Thus, by the time supper is ready, which will be within an hour or less, the camp will be properly made, and everyone's work is done save the unfortunate scullions. Pitching an A-tent. To set up an A-tent, draw the ridge rope tight between 2 trees and fasten each end with a clove hitch unless the line has stretchers. Then stake out the 4 corners in a true rectangle, that is, make each corner in a right angle instead of having them askew, then drive the other pegs. If the soil is thin, drive each peg at a sharp angle and lay a flat rock over the slant of it. If the ground is so sopping wet or so sandy that pegs will not hold, dig a rather deep hole where each peg should stand, and in it bury a rock or faggot of brush that has a bit of rope tied to it, which is left sticking out with a few inches above the ground. Stamp the earth down and tie the projecting ends of rope into the grommets. Now stretch the ridgeline taut with your rope slides, or by bracing it up with a forked sapling near each end. Do not neglect to trench the tent. It is a miserable business to crawl out into a driving storm at night and dig a ditch by lantern light, or still to awake to a realization that trenching is too late to save your soaking possessions. Make yourself ready in your cabin for the mischance of the hour, if so it hap. Setting up a wall tent. To pitch a wall tent, 4 men proceed as follows. Numbers 1 and 2 procure canvas, and numbers 3 and 4 the poles. Numbers 3 and 4 lay the ridgepole on the ground in the direction that the tent is to stand. Then lay the uprights at each end of the ridgepole and stand at right angles to it, on the side opposite that from which the wind blows. Then they drop the tent pins and hammer the respective ends of the tent. Then drive a pin at each end of the ridge to mark front and rear. Meanwhile, numbers 1 and 2 unroll the tent and spread it out over the ridgepole and on both sides of it. Numbers 1 and 3 now go to the rear, and numbers 2 and 4 in the front, and slip the pins of the uprights through the ridgepole and tent. If a fly is used, it is placed in position over tent, and the loops of the long guys over the front and the rear pole pins. Number 4 secures centered door loops over the center pin in front, and number 1 in rear, each goes to his own corner. Number 1 right rear, number 2 right front, number 3 left rear, number 4 left front. All draw bottom of tent taut and square, the front and rear at right angles to the ridge, and fasten it with pins through the corner loops, then stepping outward 2 paces from the corner, and a pace to the front, numbers 2 and 4, or rear, numbers 1 and 3. Each securely gets a long pin, over which is passed the extended corner guy rope. Care must be taken that the tent is properly squared and pinned to the ground at the door and 4 corners before raising it. Numbers 1 and 3 now go to the rear, numbers 2 and 4 to the front pole, and raise the tent to a convenient height from the ground, when numbers 2 and 3 enter and seize their respective poles, and all together raise the tent until the upright poles are vertical. While numbers 2 and 3 support the poles, numbers 1 and 4 tighten the corner guys, beginning on the windward side. The tent being thus temporarily secured, all set the guy pins and fasten the guy ropes. Numbers 1 and 2 to the right, numbers 3 and 4 left, and then the wall pins. This is the Army method, and it is the best. Erecting Sibley Tent. For a Sibley tent, make a loop in one end of its lash rope and another at such distance from this as will mark the radius of the tent when set up taut. Also another loop farther out marking the radius of the guys if the tent has a wall. Drive a peg in the center of the space that the tent is to cover, loop the end of the line over it, and with another peg used alternately in the other loops, draw 2 concentric circles in the ground. Drive the pegs and guy stakes on these circles respectively, loop on the grommet lines to the former, raise the tent, and then make all taut. The teepee. To erect a teepee, the site must be level, or very nearly so. Cut the requisite number of straight slim lodge poles, 10 or 12, and 2 longer poles for the smoke flaps. Trim them carefully, for if stubs are left on them, they will make the canvas leak. Tie 3 of them together with the lash rope about 18 inches from the top, and about the same distance above where the top of the teepee cover will come. Set these up as a tripod, the butts equidistant on a circle described on the ground as above. For a teepee of 12 feet diameter, they will be 10 feet 5 inches apart, measuring straight from one to the other. Carry the rope around them a few times where they are tied together and let it trail. Lean all the other poles, save one, against the top of the tripod, spacing their butts equidistant around the circle. Tie the top of the teepee cover at the point between the flaps to the remaining lodge pole and lift it into place. Insert the smoke poles in the pockets of the flaps, carry the cover around the outside of the framework, and pin or lace it together in front. Peg the cover down and anchor the tent by drawing the lash rope tight to a crotch driven into the ground inside the tent and on the windward side. Pitch the tent with its door to leeward of the prevailing winds. When there is no wind, keep both smoke flaps open. When it blows, raise the flap to windward and lower the other. When the wind blows directly against the entrance, close both flaps and raise the bottom of the door a little to create a draught. By the way, do not call the teepee a wigwam. The latter is a fixed residence, the former portable. Tents on rocky ground. Sometime it may be necessary to set up a tent or other camp on ground which is so rocky that stakes cannot be driven into it. In such a case, 2 tripods can be erected at a convenient distance apart for the ridge pole or rope, the tops of the tripods interlocking as shown in the illustration. A self-supporting framework for a shed roof camp is also shown. Figures 4 and 5. Browse bed. To make a bed of browse, first smooth the ground, leaving no stubs, stones, or hummocks. Then cut head and foot logs a foot thick, and side logs, which may be somewhat smaller, and pin them down with inverted crotches, making a rectangular framework on the ground to keep the browse in place. Next, fell a thrifty balsam or hemlock, spruce, pine, or even cedar will do in a pinch, and strip off the fans, using none that cannot be broken off by one's fingers. Now lay a course of boughs a foot long against the head log, butts down and to the front, then shingle another layer in front of these, and so on down the foot of the bed, leaving only the tips of the boughs showing. Such a bed is luxurious in proportion to its depth and freshness. It should be renewed every day. It takes considerable time and labor to make. I prefer the individual bed tick, filled by each man to suit himself. Precautions. Hang the salt pork or bacon to a tree beside the fireplace where it is handy. It will not spoil in the weather. If mice, wood rats, porcupines, skunks, or other thieving varmints annoy you, hang the edibles by wires or cords from branches, or from a stout wire run from one tree to another, and shelter them from sun and rain. Put matches and candles where they can be quickly found in the dark. When camping with a pack train, pile the packs neatly together and cover them with canvas, and similarly pile and protect the saddles, making especially sure that the lash ropes cannot get wet and that nothing will be buried out of sight off somewhere by itself if snow falls during the night. Soldierly system in all such matters pays a big dividend in time and good temper. A tenderfoot's camp looks like a hurrah's nest. Wild hogs are literally the bêtes noires of southern campers. Your thin-flanked, long-legged, sharp-nosed razorback, with tusks gleaming from his jaws, he or she of the third or further removed generation of feral lawlessness, is the most perverse, fearless, and maliciously destructive brute in America, wolverines and Indian devils not excepted. Shooting his tail off does not discourage him. Rocks and clubs are his amusement, and no hint to leave that is weaker than a handful of red pepper baked inside a pone of bread will drive him away. A hog-proof fence around camp, unsightly though it be, is one's only safeguard in southern wild woods. Fixed camps. If it is the intention to remain in one place for a considerable time, the site should be chosen with particular care. It should have a good outlook, but not a free inlook, being picturesque and secluded. The tent should be floored, otherwise it will be unpleasant in wet weather, and its contents will get musty or mildewed. Mildew attacks leather first, then woolens, and cotton goods last of all. A separate dining place and kitchen should be built, if for no other reason than to keep insects and vermin out of the sleeping tent. Make a dining table by driving 4 stakes into the ground for legs, nailing cleats across the ends, and covering the top with straight sticks or boards. On each side of it, build a bench on the same principle. Over these erect a framework on which stretch a tarpaulin or tent fly. Near the fireplace, build a kitchen table with a shelf underneath for utensils, condiments, baking powder, lard, etc., and with space below for a box or other bin for potatoes and onions. Make some rustic chairs, stools, and benches. As Thoreau says, none is so poor that he need sit on a pumpkin. That is shiftlessness. Sink. Dig a sink or rubbish hole near the kitchen table for dishwater, tin cans, and other such refuse as will not burn, and into this throw every day a layer of ashes or earth. Then you will not be bothered by so much flies. Have a definite place for the latrine, and build it as soldiers do, leaving a paddle in the excavated earth behind it. Whoever wrote Deuteronomy was a good camper. Cold storage. For a refrigerator, dig a hole in the ground, stone it up or line it with bark, and cover the top. Or if you have ice, bore a few holes for drainage in the bottom of a box or barrel, sink it into the ground to its top, and cover it with burlaps or a blanket. If fresh venison is put in a spring, the outside of the meat will get white and stringy, but the inside will keep sweet for several weeks. Tie a white rag to a branch or bush directly over this water cache to scare away animals. In winter, cut a hole in the ice, fasten the meat to a stick by a rope or a thong, let the meat down into the water just below the ice, with the stick resting across the orifice. If it is desired to cache meat in this way, put blocks of ice over the hole and throw water on the mass until it freezes together. No land animal can disturb such a store, and the venison will keep fresh and palatable for a couple of months at least. Butter and milk should not be stored near anything that has a pronounced odor, for they would be tainted. As soon as the campground is reached, the butter tin or jar should be placed in a net or bag and sunk in the spring or cold brook, the string being tied to the bank so that a freshet may not carry the food away or bury it out of sight. Later, if you stay in that place, a little rock-lined well can be dug near the spring and covered securely so that coons and porcupines cannot plunder it. There are camps so situated that the following note may be of service. Milk can be kept sweet for several days by adding a spoonful of grated horseradish to 1 or 2 gallons of milk. Caches. To cache provisions in trees, fasten a pole from one tree to another at the height of 15 to 20 feet from the ground, and peel the bark from the tree trunks to hinder animals from climbing them. Wrap the provisions in canvas and then in oilskin, if you have it, and wire or tie them to the pole. The odor of oilskin is said to be offensive to wolverines and other predatory beasts. A further precaution is to make a St. Andrew's cross, X-shaped, hang it from the pole, and suspend the parcel from the end of one arm of the cross, so that every puff of wind will send it swinging. A cache or secret storehouse for heavy tools, bedding, utensils, etc., that you may want to leave at the camp until the next season may be dug in a dry bank and roofed over with logs and earth, the interior being lined with dry grass and poles or bark. The old Indian method of digging a jug-shaped hole in a knoll, casting the excavated earth into a stream, lining the cache with hay and hides, and sealing it with the same piece of sod, about 20 inches in diameter, that was removed when beginning to dig the neck of the hole, is an excess of precaution nowadays. Woodyard. A chopping block is the first thing needed about a camp. The axe, when not in use, should always be stuck in that particular block, where anyone can find it when wanted, and where it will not injure men or dogs. Do not let the axe lie outdoors on a very cold night. The frost would make it brittle, so that the steel might shiver on the first knot you struck the next morning. Stretch a stout line between two trees where the sunlight will strike, and air your blankets on it every day or two when the weather is pleasant. Against a straight tree near the tent, make a rack, somewhat like a billiard cue rack, in which fishing rods can be stood, full rigged, without danger of being blown down. Of course, it takes time and hard work to make everything snug and trim around camp, but it pays, just the same, to spend a couple of days at the start rigging up such conveniences as I have described, and getting in a good supply of wood and kindling. To rush right off hunting or fishing and leave the camp in disorder is to eat your dough before it is baked. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Nathan Heck.